JFK Junior Forum. Before we begin, please note the exit doors, which are located on both the Park Street side and the JFK Street side of the forum. In the event of an emergency, walk to the exit that's closest to you and congregate in the JFK Park just over that way. And now, before we begin, please take a moment to silence your cell phones as we begin and to prepare for this evening's discussion. And now, please join me in welcoming the Chief of Staff for Governor Kate Brown and Co-Director of Membership, Summer Tan.
Thank you so much for coming tonight. I'm so honored to introduce our speakers for the night. Governor Kate Brown was the governor of Oregon from 2015 to 2013. There, she passed a historic transportation infrastructure package, was responsible for fully funding Oregon's public schools for the first time in over 30 years, and ensured that over 95% of Oregonians have access to health care. She came to Oregon from her native Minnesota, where she was studying at Lewis and Clark's Northwestern School of Law, earning a degree in law as well as a certification for environmental law. She has granted more pardons or commutations than over 50 years of Oregon governors combined. Prior to being elected, she represented families and children in the foster care system, and also those who had violated their parole. Setti D. Warren is the Institute of Politics Interim Director at the Harvard Kennedy School. Prior to being director here, he was executive director at the Shorenstein Center for Media Politics and Public Policy. He previously served as a mayor of Newton, Massachusetts, and was the first ever African American to be popularly elected as a mayor of Massachusetts. He received his BA from Boston College and his JD from Suffolk University Law School. Tenzin Gunmaro is a first year at Harvard College, where he serves as the Director of Outreach for the JFK Junior Forum, as well as the Director of Community for our Fellows in Study Groups program. Outside of the Institute, he also writes for the Harvard Advocate, as well as the Crimson, and works as a mentor at the Emerging Leaders program at the Harvard Radcliffe Institute. Thank you so much, and please welcome our guests.
Well, good evening, everyone. It's great to be with you. Governor, welcome to the JFK Junior Forum. It's great to have you here.
Thank you so much.
We're going to dive right in. Tenzin, turn over to
Yay.
Governor, first of all, thank you so much for being with us here today. Students from all around the Harvard community have come out because there's such an interest in this subject. So thank you also for particularly wanting to speak on the subject of mass incarceration. Why is this issue and this work important to you? And when did you first come to see the issue and urgency of mass incarceration and the necessity for change in the American criminal legal system?
Okay, that'll take me about a half an hour to answer that question. Good evening, everyone. I'm just delighted and so honored to be here with all of you and just thrilled to be on the Harvard campus. This issue has been important to me for as long as I can remember. I went to law school because I wanted the tools to achieve justice and equality in this world. And as a young lawyer, I had the experience of representing people in the criminal justice system through the probation and parole violation process, and saw the inequities in our criminal justice system in Portland, Oregon at the time. And for me, I am very passionate about how do we eradicate racism, and I see our criminal justice system as very much being built on racism. And certainly our criminal justice system wasn't built overnight, and I think it is going to take very strategic, very methodical deconstruction of that system in order to have a criminal justice system that we can all believe is fair and just and equitable towards all.
Well, facing sort of that structural racism that you speak about, what can governors do at the state level? I mean, there are different tools in the toolkit that we've talked about, but I'd love for you to share.
I think there are a number of things that governors can do, but I will say that the governor's clemency tool, the ability to pardon or commute sentences, is, I believe, one of the single most powerful tools to embed fairness in our criminal justice system. And I think we have seen governors recently begin to again use this tool for a number of reasons, and very excitingly seeing both governors of Democratic and Republican parties using this tool. I issued over 1,100 commutations during my time. I granted 47,000 pardons for marijuana convictions. We remitted over $14 million in fines, and I commuted the entire death row in Oregon. 17 folks were sitting on death row. They now have life without parole. And for me, it was, how can I make a difference, and how can I use the tools of the executive to make change? And using that clemency tool is very, very powerful. I did get challenged, of course, legally. The good news is the Court of Appeals upheld my authority in all of these cases, basically. But there are other tools that the governor has. In my state, the state of Oregon, I appoint judges to the bench. I appointed 112 judges during my 7 years and 11 months as governor. 50% of them were women, 25% were people of color. I appointed the first African-American woman to the appellate courts in the state of Oregon. And little story, when I graduated from law school, there'd only been one woman on the Supreme Court. In my entire career, there'd never been more than two women on the Oregon Supreme Court of 7 justices. But at one time, I appointed up to 5 of the folks on the Oregon Supreme Court, so we had a majority women on the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court elected their first woman as a chief judge ever in the history of the state of Oregon. So appointing judges and then making sure these diverse voices get reelected is incredibly important, and I focused on that. The other piece is policy, right? Making sure that I weighed in on policy that I felt was incredibly important. Governors can both work with the legislature or against the legislature, given the particular circumstances, but I both testified on legislation, encouraged legislators to pass bills that I think would help yield more fairness in our criminal justice system.
Just a quick follow-up, and then I'll hand it over to you, Tenzin. You had mentioned Republican and Democratic governors are working on this. Is there a turning of the tide in regard to criminal justice reform and bipartisan sort of work together? I mean, we saw the legislation that President Trump signed a few years ago. Do you think the tide's turning, or is...
I don't know. I'm a little concerned about where the tide is going right now in criminal justice reform, particularly after this last election cycle, which was brutal in terms of criminal justice issues. I know that President Trump was able to both move forward on what I would say positive legislation, as well as he issued a number of pardons and commutations. And obviously Biden has been supportive as well. I do think things are somewhat frozen in the movement around criminal justice, and we saw in this last election cycle very much the crime ads that are reminiscent of what we saw in the 80s and early 90s that were really, really challenging. So yes, we are seeing governors move forward and use their full clemency powers. It is incredibly important that we have organizations from across the spectrum, from Coke Industries to Van Jones, supporting the executives in using this power. And you know, right now I think it's kind of 2 steps backward and 1 step forward.
Makes sense.
Building off of that answer, what do you see as the path forward for ending the death penalty and fighting mass incarceration on a national level?
Wow. Okay. Again, another probably an hour or two long discussion. Let me talk for a minute about the death penalty. In Oregon, the death penalty hasn't been used since the late 90s. When my predecessor, John Kitzhaber, came in, he issued a moratorium on the death penalty. So it hasn't been used for a number of years. The reason I felt strongly about commuting the sentences of those sitting on death row is, first of all, I saw our system as being unfair and unjust and inequitable, but it also, frankly, is incredibly expensive, and it doesn't provide the level of safety that folks think it's going to provide, and we're not using it. So it made sense. The death penalty movement is incredibly challenging. For a state like Oregon, we have to go to the ballot and have voters approve a change to the Constitution. So what is happening instead is that the legislature is making inroads on reducing the number of crimes that the death penalty would apply to, effectively modifying the death penalty, and I think that is, for now, the right approach. In terms of nationally, we're seeing both Republican and Democratic governors commuting the row. Recently, Kevin Stitt, the governor of Oklahoma, chose to put an adult in custody on life without parole as opposed to having him be executed. So it's going to take courageous acts of governors, but it's also going to take a very strategic and focused campaign at the national level. In terms of mass incarceration, I think there are a number of things that can be done, both how do we, because the system was built on racism, how do we humanize our criminal justice system? And I think there's steps that we can take that might be more palatable to voters, to Americans, as we work to transform the system into a system that we all agree is more fair and just. We could go into this one for a long time.
Yeah. Can I ask a brief follow-up? I was going to ask, as an executive, from your experience, how can you best communicate this with constituents, communicate criminal justice changes, pardons, anything of the like?
So my experience is this is a very difficult area for governors, particularly female governors, to communicate in. And as women, it's incredibly important that we have third-party validators. And unfortunately, that usually means a male person. And so in working with organizations, I think there are a number of organizations that can help provide that validation. First of all, faith organizations, and so using people of faith, and in my case, particularly men of faith, was helpful. Number two, using the data really clearly and showing that information to voters is important. Of the commutations that I made, 40% were Black. And that data reflects the disproportionate representation of Black and brown people and Indigenous people in Oregon's prison system. So the data can be very helpful. But sometimes I have to tell you, it's pretty lonely up there making these really tough calls. And there's certainly organizations, ACLU and others, that can be supportive, but I think it's really important as executives start to feel comfortable in making these decisions that there's both individuals that support them, like all of you, writing them emails or notes or calling them and saying, way to go, this is the right thing to do, that there is organizational support, and that there are community members that are counterintuitive. For example, Koch brothers supporting this work, and that's really helpful. Good question.
That is a good question. How do we prevent people from going back to prison? The recidivism question.
I think there's a number of things. Because of how our prison system was built, we remove people from their families. And specifically in Oregon, we built prisons in rural communities for economic development in those rural communities. But guess what? When the majority of folks are from urban Oregon, that means families, children, spouses have to drive 3, 5, 6 hours to see their loved one that's been incarcerated. So charging for phone calls feels inhumane to me. Really restricting visitation hours. I know obviously the system needs to function, but opening that up in a way that's more family friendly is really, really helpful. I think making sure people can maintain connections with their loved ones is key. The other thing that I think is really sort of bizarre is that the majority of folks that come into our prison system have some type of substance abuse issue or behavioral health issue. At least in Oregon, we don't allow them access to drug and alcohol treatment until 6 months prior to them being released. That's abhorrent. If they had diabetes, we would all be appalled, of course, if they didn't get the right drugs or the right foods or whatever they needed. And here we are, intentionally denying folks access to a proven medical assistance. I find it really appalling. I hope it changes in this legislative session. I mentioned about the families. The other piece is education and work. About 2/3, 70% of Oregon adults in custody are either working or attending some type of educational program. The educational programming is fairly limited. But I attended a class at the Oregon State Penitentiary in December. I was blown away by the work, the intellectual discussion, the books the adults were reading. It was really extraordinary. These are college professors coming in and giving classes. This is a lifeline for many of these. It was a men's prison, so many of these men. And then working. I mean, our work roles behind bars tend to be very much gender-oriented. That's changing. Obviously, we have a variety in the men's prison from corrections enterprises where they make clothing or building furniture, but some of it's very limited, and we need to be able to expand those opportunities for our adults in custody, because it provides employment opportunities once they're released from custody. If they can maintain family connections, they feel connected. And of course, as the former Secretary of State, I have to say, making sure folks get registered to vote when they leave the system, because we know that folks that are participating in voting after they leave the prison system are much less likely to reoffend. And that's because Secretary Tennant is here to remind me about voting. So anyway, that's incredibly important.
Yeah, that was a perfect transition. I was just about to ask about voting. But Oregon, like most of the states around the country, prevents those currently incarcerated from voting, but many states around the country have much worse barriers for formerly incarcerated people. Yeah, as a former Secretary of State also, what do you see as the role of voting in the fight against mass incarceration?
I think it's incredibly important that we get more people civically engaged, of course, and I'm really proud of the work some of my governors are doing to re-enfranchise felons that in their state would be permanently prohibited from voting. Terry McAuliffe, when he was governor of Virginia, re-enfranchised 185,000 people. I think most recently there's been other governors that have taken similar paths. To me, that's very exciting. In Oregon, once you leave prison, you can register to vote. There is a bill in the Oregon legislature right now that would allow adults in custody to vote. It is a very heated conversation, as you might imagine. I don't know whether it will pass this session, but I think it's a really important conversation as we look at our past history of how our Constitution was set up, particularly as it relates to slavery, and how slaves were only considered partial human being, of course, in our Constitution, and how taking away that right to vote is very much a part of dehumanizing people. And so I think this is an important conversation. I think you're going to see more and more jurisdictions re-enfranchise people as they leave the system, and possibly see more jurisdictions doing that while folks are behind bars. I know that Washington, D.C. and 2 other states certainly allow adults in custody to vote.
Governor, I'm sure you remember, as I do, in the 80s and 90s, states were putting in place mandatory minimums for all sorts of crimes, from lower level to upper level. What effect did that have on the judiciary branch at the state level and the district attorney's offices?
I can talk about what happened in Oregon. We passed ballot measure 11, which was one strike you're out law, and it essentially sent people to prison forever for certain crimes, from rape to murder to severe assaults. It was passed in 1994. The population of our prison system exploded. And we went from having 6,000 to 8,000 people now to roughly, right now there's about 12,000. Before the pandemic, it was up to 14,000, and that number, I suspect, will continue to grow. More troublingly, it impacted our young people. And ballot measure 11 automatically waived young people into the adult system, people over the age of 15. And so you can imagine what happened. We had many young people coming into our adult system, and unfortunately, young black men were incarcerated at 17 times the rate higher than young white men. So it's been incredibly devastating on our black and our brown men. But it also impacted women. The incarceration rates for women since that passed have tripled. There was another ballot measure that passed. Oregon is a very active ballot measure state. That was a get tough on property crime measure, and that combined with ballot measure 11 has really increased the number of women coming into prison. What it has done in terms of the judicial branch is it has eliminated judicial discretion, and that is a huge loss in terms of judges' ability to make fair and impartial decisions, and it has totally and completely empowered the district attorneys. And I think that is why you're seeing district attorneys, at least in Oregon, be frustrated with my work around clemency and commutation, because they feel like they imposed the sentence through their charging practices. And so it has flipped who has the power in our criminal justice system, and I think that's not necessarily a good thing.
Just a quick follow-up. What do you think that did to communities? And what were the effects? A lot of times we focus on the person, but we don't focus on the community. Could you speak to that?
It has been devastating for our communities, particularly our black communities, particularly our brown communities, and both economically, in terms of relationships. It has torn families apart. It is not a good thing.
Okay, before I hand things over to Tenzin for the last question, you can begin to line up at the microphones. There's one there, there's one there, there's one in Lowe's box up there, there's one up there, as Tenzin asks the last question. So.
I'm going to step in before
Yeah,
Tenzin asks the next question. Yeah. I just want to add that in 2019, our legislature, which required a 2/3 vote of the House and the Senate, was able to make a substantial change to ballot measure 11, which was our one strike you're out measure, and it is now allowing prospectively youth to have the opportunity to both have their sentences reconsidered halfway through their sentence, but also it's not an automatic waiver to adult court. So that is a really good thing. It's a very courageous thing. It happened to a Republican senator, very strongly. A second chance. I agree with her. And unfortunately, she was dying at the time. This was her dying wish that we pass this bill. And the legislature stepped up. I'm very proud they did it. It was a very courageous thing to do.
And just one follow-up to that. What have been the results of getting rid of that one strike?
Well, two things. Number one, we're seeing a bit more fairness in the system. The judges have more say in these cases. And we also know now the brain science about young people's brains, and that information is available for judges to consider, whereas before it was absolutely not. So it's been good. The bill was prospective. I essentially moved a portion of the young people that were impacted by ballot measure 11, but Senate Bill 1008 didn't impact. We took a look at those cases, and we have allowed the parole board to see these cases, and I think 73 of them. There's some more work to do there, though. So, Tenzin.
Yeah, on a hopeful note, zooming out, I'm wondering what you imagine as a better model for public safety, something for the future to see a world without mass incarceration.
Wow. I see a very different world than the one we have in the United States. We incarcerate in this United States more people, I think, than most any other, I've got lots of head nodding, any other country in the world. And it obviously disproportionately impacts our communities of color. I see a system where people are held accountable, where they have an opportunity to rehabilitate themselves. We know a huge portion of the folks that go to prison, at least in states like Oregon, are illiterate, that they have an opportunity to get an education, that they have an opportunity to get the educational opportunities that they need, and that they come out of that system. I don't know what it would look like, certainly not like the one we have now, ready to step up, support their families, and give back to their communities. And I think that's going to require an entire revamping of the criminal justice system that we have now. Wow. I'm going to have to think about that one, Tenzin.
Great. Okay. I'm going to start over here.
Hello, Governor. My name is Elazar Chacha. Thank you so much. It's so refreshing seeing an elected official like yourself talking about these issues that we care about so much. I am not from Oregon. I'm from California. And in my state, individuals who are incarcerated, even though they fought the wildfires that were there, they could not get a job as a firefighter because they had a formal conviction. And so I don't know if that's the same in your state, but I'm wondering what other issues like that, for people who are incarcerated, what barriers are like that do you see are there, and what can governors like yourself address that? How do you address that?
So I will just say I did pardon sentences for some of our adults in custody that did the wildfire fighting. I did not do a universal blanket, but I do think we should be allowing these folks, once they're released or whether their sentence is commuted or not, to fight wildfires. As you know, this is an incredibly challenging issue for most of the entire Western region. And we need folks who are willing to do this work. As an aside, I will tell you what the Oregon Department of Forestry told me. They want to hire these folks, particularly the women. They found that the women are particularly effective and committed to the work. So we have got to find a way to make this happen. But in terms of barriers, there's many. Public benefits are prohibited for many folks coming out of custody. So that limits access to housing. You talked about employment, licensing. There's all kinds of licensing that are required for various and sundry jobs. Having a felony on your record prohibits you from getting those licensed. So we don't provide people with access to housing. We don't provide them with the ability to make an income. We don't give them very much money coming out. We don't always provide them with access to health care. We're working hard to make sure that that transition is seamless once you're in custody to the Oregon Health Plan. It's really, really challenging for folks coming out of our incarceral system to find the work they need to support themselves. So it's not surprising that they reoffend again, right? Absolutely. And most likely they didn't get the help they needed for their substance abuse or behavioral health issues. So we put up all these barriers and then we're like wondering why they're not succeeding. It's because all of us put barriers in their way.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
You're so welcome.
Just a quick reminder before we go over here, just say your name and affiliation here at the school, and remember, end your question with a question.
Sure. Hi, Governor. My name is Kristen Myers, and I'm an MPA student here at the Kennedy School. Thank you for your time today. You talked a bit about the intersection of substance abuse and incarceration. I'm wondering, can you talk more about what we can do at the state and federal level to address the intersection of mental health and incarceration?
I certainly can, but it is certainly a challenging arena. I absolutely believe that everyone in this country deserves the right to access health care, and in my mind, behavioral health is part of that system. We in this country stigmatize those who seek to get the care they need for behavioral health issues. And I think we have to destigmatize that. And I'm so proud of folks that are starting to speak out when they are seeking care. Senator Fetterman obviously being one of those folks doing that. But both behavioral health and substance abuse disorders oftentimes are combined, as you well know. And our systems aren't set up in a way, I think, to deal with these co-occurring issues. And I think particularly as folks get criminally involved, we tend to want to take them off the streets and put them in prison and get them out of our way, right? And we have got to figure out a way to make sure that folks have access to the behavioral health supports that they need, so they can live healthy lives. And part of that is making sure that our behavioral health workforce is culturally responsive to the needs of our communities. And that is something we have invested in Oregon, but we're still struggling, right, to make sure that we have the support and services that people across the state need. And I know it's an issue for communities across this entire United States. Again, this is a conversation we could have for many, many hours. But the most important thing is to start treating mental health issues like they are just any other medical issues. And that is the top priority for us as a country, I absolutely believe. And then making sure that everyone, regardless of where you're from or your income, has access to the full complement of medical services in this country.
Thank you.
Thank you. Go up there.
Hi, Governor. Hello.
Oh,
Hi, Governor. How are you? We clearly have a problem where innocent people are becoming incarcerated because of a due process problem. People are entitled to representation, but not always quality representation. And clearly, if public defenders don't have enough resources, it's a systematic problem. We also have judges that may be serving on the bench too long and are not weeded out. And we also have a jury system that may be too enamored by CSI Miami and not well educated and listening to facts. What are your thoughts on how we could improve the due process system to avoid innocent people ending up in jail, in prisons?
Okay. There are a couple things. I have not practiced law in a number of years, and the base of my practice, as Summer eloquently said, was representing parents and juveniles in the juvenile dependency system. But my last year of practicing law was in 2007. I was a relatively experienced lawyer at the time. I was working 20 hours a week. I had 90 children on my caseload, and I was being paid $2,000 a month. So that gives you a sense of how overloaded the system is, and that's just the dependency side. I'm sure the delinquency side as well as the criminal justice side are just as overwhelmed. In states like Oregon, we are failing to provide adequate representation, and it's twofold. I would argue it's probably not enough people doing the work, but we also aren't paying them adequately. And one of the issues is pay parity between criminal defense lawyers and the district attorneys. Complicated conversation, but we should be paying them equally or equivalently for the work that they are doing. In terms of jury systems, I can speak to Oregon. Embarrassingly, we were one of two states, Louisiana being the other one, that only until recently, a U.S. Supreme Court ruling, Ramos decision, where we allowed a non-unanimous jury. Again, very much based in racism. And I think we have to be paying, we are finding on boards and commissions, if we want diverse representation of our communities to reflect the communities, we have to pay people to do these volunteer jobs. If you want a diverse representation on your juries, you need to pay people, not just $10 or $15. It needs to be what they would be making that day. And that's how you get a jury that is more reflective of our communities. Did you have another question in there?
About judges, quality of judges.
Quality judges, well, I'm personally very pleased with the quality of judges that I appointed to the bench. Like I said, 112. For me, it was incredibly important that I appointed judges that understood the fairness and justice dynamics happening in our criminal justice system and saw the racism happening. But not everybody gets that opportunity, and not all states have gubernatorial appointments. And in some states, they have partisan elections, and we're seeing that play out in Wisconsin. Our judicial branch is incredibly important. I think we all know this. And who we appoint, who we elect to the judicial branch, we're all going to have to tune into this. And that means probably paying more attention to these elections and, frankly, figuring out better ways to fund these elections, because campaign dollars are blowing these elections out of proportion as well. That's another conversation for another forum. So, thank you.
Thank you. Go over here.
Hi, my name is Artha Jonassin. I'm a junior at the college studying government and global health and health policy. Thank you, Madam Governor, for being here, and thank you, Tenzin and Mr. Warren, for moderating such an enriching discussion. My question for you is that there is an undeniable connection between education, literacy rates rather, and incarceration rates. So with that, what role do you think education plays in lowering mass incarceration in the United States? And at a higher level, what role do you think an intersectoral approach to ending mass incarceration looks like?
So we knew, I first became a legislator, I was appointed in 1991. The committee I got to serve on was the Judiciary Committee. And we knew back in the 90s, we had RAND studies that told us very, very clearly that if we invest, for every dollar we invest in early childhood education, we save $8, $10, $17 and prevention in our criminal justice system. So another part of my legacy, I hope, is the fact that I worked really hard to create a seamless system of education, literally from cradle to career, and invested significantly in early childhood education. Because we know the brain science tells us 90% of the brain development is in the first 5 years. And we know that it is those years that are formative. And as a nation, as a country, we have chosen not to make those investments. States like Oregon, and I'll bet Louisiana and a whole lot of other states that are represented here, do not have the resources to fully fund a complete early childhood education program. That's what is absolutely needed in this country if we want to eliminate the opportunity gaps in this country amongst our communities of color. And so we have to do it. We know what the right thing is. We just need to make sure we make it happen.
Good evening, Governor. Thank you so much for being with us here tonight. My name is May Weston, and I'm a senior at the college studying history of science and government. And my question for you is, during the Black Lives Matter movement, one of the major solutions that we heard to mass incarceration was defund the police or abolish the police. And I'm wondering what your comments are on those suggested solutions.
So I have to tell you, and I said this earlier to one of the groups, I have been working to eradicate racism in state government for a number of years, and I really struggled as the chief executive, as the governor, to get traction on this issue until George Floyd was murdered. And it is the first time that many people in state government and obviously around the country woke up and said, yes, we need to do something. So for me, I had been working with my diversity, equity, and inclusion team to develop a racial justice council before then, but that was the catalyst I needed to create that council. And the goal of the Racial Justice Council is to center the lives of our Black and Brown and Indigenous communities in both the legislative policy making for the governor and in the budget. And I am really listened to those folks. They literally set my agenda for 2022, and they helped develop the budget for 23-25. And it is their policies that I listen to in terms of criminal justice reform. We were successful in some, not in others. And so I'm listening to the communities and what they want, and that's how I responded to it.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
We'll go over here.
Thank you so much, Governor, for your time this evening. My name is Megan Hereford, and I'm an LLM student at the law school. I was wondering what your thoughts are on the role of probation and parole in the carceral system. I think studies show that those have a huge impact on recidivism. I'm curious on your thoughts about the governor's relationship with probation and parole department, and if you used, in your time as governor, your power of clemency or pardon specifically to address parole and probation.
No, I did not, but I did have the opportunity, and it's more because of how the system works. I did have the opportunity to appoint the 5 members of the parole board, and this is another area where the governor can set the tone and play a role, is appointing a diverse board that reflects the community and the direction that she wants to go in. And so I was very conscientious about who I put on that board and why I put them on that board. And then I didn't hear the first part of your question.
Just on your thoughts about I guess the governor, if you have executive power in Oregon to control how the probation and parole department operates, how it supervises, or if that's really reserved for the judiciary. I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that relationship.
At least in my state, I don't have particular authority over the probation system. And the parole system with ballot measure 11 has been substantially modified. So I just say, in my state, not a lot of input.
Great. We'll go back over here.
Yeah. Hi, Governor. Thanks for being here. My name is Zishan. I'm a recent graduate of the Harvard Divinity School, where I studied the intersection of politics and religion. I'm an Oregonian. I'm a product of Oregon public schools. I've been involved in race and equity activism in Oregon since I was in high school. I guess just very simply, I'm wondering what your advice is to the next generation for channeling the utter progressive energy of Oregon into ending mass incarceration and lifting up voices, Black and brown voices, in what is such a predominantly white state.
Wow. Okay. Number one, vote. As I shared with the group this morning, I literally won my first race, a Democratic primary, by 7 votes. So I am living proof that your vote really does matter. And I will tell you, to this day, I still have people say to me, Governor Brown, I was your 7th vote. I was the reason you won. Number 2, run for office. The Oregon legislature is the most diverse it has ever been. It's really, really exciting. We have literally 5 people from the Vietnamese American community in the state house. I think that's more than any other state legislative house in the entire country. So run for office. But I think in terms of how do we eliminate mass incarceration, it is going to take strategy, it's going to take focus, it's going to take passion, it's going to take patience, and it's going to take persistence. And let me tell you why I know that. I started working on LGBTQ equality in 1991. That was on the backs of folks who've been working since 1973. We weren't able to pass the non-discrimination legislation and domestic partnerships till 2007. That's how long it took. It takes time. You have to build allies, you have to work collaboratively, you have to build partnerships, you have to work with the business community, you have to be very creative about this. You have to be thoughtful and really strategic. So you can do this, we can do this. I'll give you my phone number, not on live TV, but I'll give you my phone number, and we can talk about how we can make it happen in Oregon and across the country.
Thank you.
That's great. Go up there.
Hi, Governor. Thanks so much for being with us. My name is Jack. I'm a sophomore at the college, and I'm curious as to your thoughts on the use of solitary confinement in prisons. I'm in a psychology class, and we've seen some pretty compelling research about the effects of solitary confinement, especially on youth inmates. I'm also from New York, so the story of Khalif Browder and the use of solitary confinement in Rikers Island has been especially impactful on me. So is there a way to reduce the use in prisons in Oregon and around the country?
Absolutely. Governors need to tell their directors of their departments of corrections that it should not be allowed. And then they need to follow up and hold those directors accountable. And citizens across the United States need to say, this is unacceptable in these United States of America, given what we know about the impact psychologically on these adults in custody, and particularly the impact on young people in custody. It should be banned. How do you make it happen? It's a whole different issue. Again, strategic, thoughtful, build partnerships, get the data out there. So.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Great. Ryan.
Good evening, Governor. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Ryan. I'm a junior at the college. My question for you is, when we're kind of trying to tackle these questions of criminal justice reform, reforming our prison system, obviously America has a pretty bad problem with that. How can we look to other systems abroad, and what systems do you think could serve as a model for a reformed U.S. criminal justice system?
I think there are a number of systems that could be used as a model. I think one of the ones that many folks in the criminal justice system look at is the Norwegian system. I can just look at the state of Minnesota and see how they incarcerate women, and it's very different than how we incarcerate women in the state of Oregon. So I think there are a ton of models. We just have to have the will. I think that's incredibly important. I also think it's really important that we rely on folks with lived experiences. I've been working with Michael Thompson at the Michael Thompson Clemency Project out of Michigan. I have a number of folks that I'm working with in Oregon that I commuted their sentences. I think they need to be telling their stories and sharing their stories. It's how we can help change minds and hearts, and it's one of the ways to soften the electorate when these get tough on crime measures come around, so that folks understand how ineffective our criminal justice system is currently being, and how much more effective another system, whether it's Norway or another system, could be. So it's about changing hearts and minds, it's about spending the time and the investment, and it's about being coordinated, and that's really challenging right now. So.
I want to ask you a question. I want to go back to something you said that I think is actually very important. There were two components to it. One, I had asked you, is there more bipartisan work? You said actually we're frozen, and then you said the elections in 2022 actually sort of felt like we were moving backwards. And we know that the politics around district attorneys around the country, people are going after them. saying they're soft on crime. You have Mayor Adams sort of criticizing the DA in New York, Manhattan. What does this all mean in regard to the types of, what does this mean in regard to the types of reforms you're talking about putting in place? What's the juxtaposition between the political winds where the winds are blowing now and where you think we need to go?
I think we need more really talented, engaged young people to go to law school and at some point run for district attorneys in their communities. I think it's incredibly important. There is a movement, there are movements, there are organizations working to elect progressive district attorneys in communities around the United States. But San Francisco was a kind of a wake-up call.
San Francisco, yeah.
Chesa Boudin. On the other hand, you got Pamela Price in Oakland doing really great work. I would argue that Michael Schmidt in the city of Portland is also doing really great work. So we need to make sure that really talented, fairness-minded young lawyers or lawyers who have experience and are committed to the criminal justice system run for these offices, and then we need to support them both financially and by helping with their campaigns. In terms of the juxtaposition, again, you and I, this feels very much like the 80s and 90s all over again. The good news is in states like Oregon, the voters voted and justice won. Justice reform-minded candidates in this past election cycle were successful, but it was really, really hard and it was really, really painful, both on the candidates and their families. But I think we need people who are brave and courageous, and we need to be supporting them in this work. And I think we need to do a better job educating voters. One of the, I'm not sure it's a silver lining from the pandemic, but in states like Oregon, we use data and science to make policy decisions during the pandemic. I'm hopeful we will carry that through into other areas of public policy making, because the statistics are stark in terms of the impact on our communities of color, in terms of women, in terms of families, in terms of the impact economically to these communities. We need to get those statistics out in a way that Americans are willing to listen and hear them and absorb that information. And I think they will, and they do. It's just choosing your battles and having a targeted, strategic forward plan.
Great, thank you. Robert.
Yep. Hi, my name's Robert. I'm a sophomore at the college. I guess I was wondering, so we've been talking about how in a lot of the United States, crime is getting really bad and politicians are trying to use that as part of their political platforms to stoke fear among the electorate. At the same time, we really want to be dealing with these important issues within criminal justice, death row, the death penalty. How do you, because I think most people would agree who study this issue that the inhumane policies we have in the criminal justice system are not the answer to be tough on crime. But how would you say politicians and elected officials need to be tackling the issues in cities like New York and Chicago, where there is rampant gun violence, to try to bring that down?
Well, we had an initiative which invested $15 million to reduce gun violence in the state of Oregon, and it's not about building more prison cells. That is not how you end gun violence in these cities. I think there's a number of things. I know there's some really creative projects happening, from peer-to-peer mentorships to making sure that young people have access to mentoring and educational opportunities, making sure that students can be successful in the school systems that they are in. We have found that, it sounds relatively simple, but career and technical education, for the students that are engaged in those programs, if they take 2 or more classes of CTE, the graduation rate moves up to 98 to 99%. Plus then you have students leaving high school with skills that enable them to engage in the workforce. So I think there's a myriad of solutions. We just have to choose as a society that we are willing to make those investments. And I will just say there's nothing better than investing in early childhood education to eliminate the opportunity gaps and particularly when we get the biggest bang for our dollars. We as a society, as the United States, have not chosen to do that, and it's incredibly unfortunate.
So investments in people and not prisons is what you're going with this.
Absolutely.
Okay, we'll make this the last question.
Okay, sorry. My name's Andre. I'm a first year at the college. I first want to just say thank you for being here, and then also thank you for all of your work with clemency and making it palatable for like the American people. Both of my parents went to prison when I was 2, and actually in June, my mom will be going in front of the clemency board in Washington to see if she'll be released. So thank you so much for that. It means a lot. My question is, a lot of students at this university, specifically people within my circles, are taking courses on like prison abolition. Seeing as the American penal system came from slavery, do you think a system that already has cracks in its foundation can be reformed, or do you think abolition is the way or the road that we should go down?
So I will say this. I got involved in public service because I absolutely believe, and I still to this day, over 30 years later, that each one of us can make a difference in this world, wherever we choose to make that difference. I'm not sure I know the right path, but I do know that we have to try something. And I just want to close by sharing a story that gives me hope. There is a class going at the Oregon State Pen, outside in, where students come in from one of the local universities, and they're literally sharing a classroom with adults in custody. Through that class came the idea that we should eradicate slavery from the Oregon Constitution. It was still in our Constitution. The students and the adults in custody wanted to know how they could make that happen. They went to the legislature. The legislature referred a measure to eradicate slavery from Oregon's Constitution. And it was the students and the adults in custody who I had granted commutations to that worked together to be successful in that campaign, and it succeeded in November of 2022. That's how I know each and every one of us, regardless of where we came from, who our parents were, what our income is, that's how I know each and every one of us can make a difference. So go forth and change the world, and happy to share any insights that I have, and happy to chat with you via email or phone. So, and I wish you the best.
Thank you.
Governor, it's 7 p.m.
Okay.
Thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thank you.
Really wonderful.
Thank you.
Tenzin, thank you.
Thank you. He was great. This
Terrific.
is his first one.
Yes.
He did great. And Summer introduced us. She did great too. So thank you all.
That was great.